What's up, Nerdlings? Today we're going to be looking at cellular energetics. Let's get started. So the goal at the end of this unit is that you should be able to describe the role that energy plays in living organisms. So let us consider this, the first law of thermodynamics, which I'm sure most of you have probably heard about in one of your previous science classes. The first law of thermodynamics states that energy cannot be created, nor can it be destroyed, but it can only be transformed from one type of energy to the next. And living systems need to continually acquire and transform energy in order to remain living. So organisms require free energy, and free energy is the amount of energy available in a system to be able to do work. So if we look at free energy, it goes into metabolism. And so in metabolism, organisms have to be able to utilize energy in order to move, in order to grow, and in order to reproduce. So we have some vocabulary that you should be familiar with from ecology. So first of all, autotrophs. Autotrophs use energy from the environment to convert inorganic molecules into organic compounds, where free energy is stored. And they are the producers in all food chains on Earth. Now we have two different types of autotrophs. We have photosynthetic autotrophs and we have chemoautotrophs. And so photosynthetic organisms or photosynthetic autotrophs use visible light energy to convert water as well as carbon dioxide into oxygen gas and organic compounds such as sugar precursors. And this occurs in all plants as well as phytoplankton. Now, the second type of autotroph is called chemoautotrophs or chemosynthetic organisms. And if that sounds kind of like chemicals, chemistry, you are correct, because these organisms don't actually use energy from the sunlight. They use energy from inorganic compounds. And one of the examples of these would be archaeobacteria, which are extremophiles. They love harsh or extreme environments. And some of these live in these hydrothermal vents. And so they use the process of chemosynthesis to produce organic compounds. So then we have heterotrophs, meaning that they're gaining energy from different trophic levels. And if you've ever looked at one of those pyramids, each of those different levels is called a trophic level or an energy level. So heterotrophs, hetero means different, get their energy from different trophic levels. And heterotrophs release free energy from organic compounds from the food chain that they've acquired from either autotrophs or from other heterotrophs. And they convert those organic compounds into inorganic compounds. So we have two different types of heterotrophs. We have anaerobic and we have aerobic. Anaerobic means without oxygen. So these heterotrophs do not require oxygen. So for example, bacteria as well as yeast do not require oxygen. Now these are also referred to as facultative anaerobes, meaning that they can do this if they have to. Now, the majority of fungi as well as animals are aerobic heterotrophs, meaning that they use oxygen, and they actually release 20 times more free energy from food molecules than anaerobes do. So, fun fact, if you really think about it, you're actually eating sunshine every single day. You take that constant supply of energy from the sun, and we pair it with a series of coupled reactions for our metabolism. And these are referred to as endergonic and exergonic paired reactions that make this happen. In endergonic reactions, the activation energy needed to start the reaction is higher than in exergonic. In endergonic, we're basically storing energy, and we're storing this energy in the bonds of compounds. So an example of an endergonic coupled reaction would be photosynthesis, and then the exergonic part of that would be cellular respiration. So it takes a larger input of energy into photosynthesis to form all of those bonds in order to store. And so those have technically a higher potential energy because they have all of this energy that's stored. In an exergonic reaction, it takes less activation energy, but in that reaction, energy is being released. So at the end of that reaction, there's not as much energy left over because it's been released into the system. So photosynthesis is endergonic and cellular respiration is exergonic. So we refer to these as spontaneous or non-spontaneous. An exergonic reaction is referred to as spontaneous because once it gets going, once that activation energy has been released or used, then that energy spontaneously occurs, or that reaction spontaneously occurs. Now with an endergonic reaction, that is not spontaneous, meaning that energy has to drive that reaction in order for all of those molecules to have energy stored in the bonds that form between them. So again, exergonic is a spontaneous reaction that's going to release energy, and endergonic is a non-spontaneous reaction that's going to store energy. So taking a look at some of the endergonic and exergonic reactions. So let's take a look at a couple of coupled reactions. So again, we have our photosynthesis and our cellular respiration. So in photosynthesis, if you look here, we don't have a lot of free energy at the beginning of this reaction. We're taking carbon dioxide and water. We are using energy, so it's basically this uphill to create glucose. Now at the end of this, we have a high potential energy. We have a lot of energy that's stored in the bonds of this glucose molecule. So at the end of this reaction, we have a lot of energy that could be utilized. So a lot of that potential energy stored up in the bonds. And again, this would be an endergonic reaction. Now, conversely, we have cellular respiration, which is going to utilize that glucose and the energy stored in the bonds of this molecule, kind of represented by this little wagon going down the hill. And again, this is a spontaneous reaction. Still have to give that cart a little push. So we do have an activation energy that is initially required to kind of give that cart a bump or get that process started. But once that process is started, it is spontaneous and it releases energy into the system. Now, at the end of this reaction, we don't have as much free energy available. Another coupled pair of reactions is called oxidative phosphorylation. So in oxidative phosphorylation, just like photosynthesis, it is an endergonic reaction. So we are taking ADP, or adenosine diphosphate, and we are going to phosphorylate it, meaning we are going to add a phosphate onto ADP, and eventually we will have ATP, which, as most of you know, is the energy currency within the cell. And so we have that input, and it is basically going uphill, but once we get up that hill, we're going to have a compound that can release energy. So this has a higher amount of energy after the reaction that's stored in the bonds of those phosphate molecules. And every time we break one of those phosphate molecules off, it releases that energy into the system. And we call this an exergonic reaction. So energy is being released into the system. So we're taking ATP, we are cleaving off that phosphate group, and it releases energy into the system. And this would be an example of a spontaneous reaction. So on to the second law of thermodynamics. Now, this one gets a little bit more complicated. So it states that every time energy is transformed, the entropy, or we could refer to this as the disorder or randomness of the universe, increases. So in order to increase or maintain their internal order, living systems must process more ordered forms of matter into less ordered ones with a constant input of energy. Now, that might seem to contradict the fact that we're building complex organisms and we have the process of evolution taking place. Now, what complicates it is, yes, whenever those organisms are transferring energy from one type to another, it does increase the entropy, but it increases the entropy of the universe. We do have closed systems, and so in those closed systems, you can actually decrease the entropy by building, but overall, that's actually going to increase the entropy or disorder and randomness in the universe itself. Complicated, I know. So matter and energy move into living systems from the environment, and living systems transform matter and energy and return it to the environment. So take Mr. Frog, for example. He ingests food. Maybe he ate a fly or a mosquito. So after he ingests that food, we use that energy, or he uses that energy, or she, might be a female frog, for respiration. They use it for production to increase their biomass. They use it or lose it through waste, and then mortality or predation. And in this sense, some of that energy would be transferred on to whatever organism decided to eat the frog. Now, something that most of you have probably seen is you've seen trophic levels, and you've seen that transfer of energy from one trophic level to the next. So for example, if we started off with 1,000 joules of energy from the sunlight, only 10 of those gets transferred to the plant. Now, that energy transfer from sun to plant, it actually loses about 99% of the energy. Now, the rest of the time, we have that 10% rule. So after that initial 99% loss of energy going from the sunlight to the energy that those plants can actually utilize, we have that 10% rule. So starting with the plant, it has 10 joules of available energy to transfer on to its next level. So only 10 joules can get transferred onto the herbivore that eats the plant. Only one of those joules of energy can get transferred on to the top level predator that might eat the herbivore. And so all of the other types of energy, or the rest of that energy, is lost to the environment through heat or through waste. And so we have these multi-step metabolisms that are occurring constantly. And first of all, don't worry, you do not need to know all of these reactions that are going on in the citric acid cycle. This is just to demonstrate how complex all of these little energy transformations are, and how many of these are simultaneously going on in our body at once. And so to increase control, living systems produce free energy in many multi-stepped pathways mediated by enzyme catalysts. So moving on to this guy. So this is called Gibbs free energy equation. And I know it looks a little bit complicated. So first of all, know that you do not have to use this on the test. So you're not ever going to be given a problem where you're going to have to calculate the Gibbs free energy or the available energy. But you do need to be at least familiar with it and familiar with what it's representing in case you were ever given an example of it on an exam. And so we refer to this as Gibbs free energy, or you might want to think of it as the energy that is available to do work. And so we're looking at exergonic and endergonic reactions. So looking at our exergonic and endergonic reactions, in an exergonic reaction, we are releasing energy into the universe. And so delta G is going to be less than 0. So it's releasing energy into the universe. In an endergonic reaction, we are going to basically be taking that and storing it into the bonds of, for example, glucose, if we're talking about photosynthesis. So in the endergonic reaction, our delta G, or the available energy, is greater than 0. So for photosynthesis, we would have a available energy in all of those glucose bonds, or all of the bonds in the glucose molecule, that is greater than 0. Conversely, in cellular respiration, we are breaking that molecule down and utilizing the energy. So the delta G in cellular respiration would be less than 0. So now we are going to look at the enthalpy. So the enthalpy is a change in the reaction, and the enthalpy is talking about the total energy, or the total thermal energy, if we want to be very specific, of a reaction. And so we refer to these as either exothermic, releasing heat or releasing energy, or endothermic, basically keeping that heat in because we are synthesizing molecules. So you can kind of think of it like this. If we start off with a lot of energy, for example, stored in the bonds of glucose, and we release that energy, we are going from a higher enthalpy to a lower enthalpy, or a big H to a little h. And as that cart goes down the hill, it decreases the amount of potential energy that it has left because we're breaking those bonds. So eventually it's going to release energy and we will get our little h. And going from our big H to our little h would be a spontaneous reaction. So next thing that goes into this Gibbs free energy or available energy equation is temperature. And so as the temperature increases, the molecules involved become more frantic and they're moving around a lot more, and they make the reaction more spontaneous. So take, for example, a cherry bomb. If I just sat this on a desk, nothing would really happen, right? It's not going to just spontaneously erupt. We have to have something that causes that increase in the movement of the molecules. So if we add fire, all of a sudden, all of those molecules are going to be moving around a lot. We're going to get an explosion. And that would be an example of a spontaneous reaction, and it would be exothermic or exergonic, releasing energy into the system. Now, next up is delta S. Now, this is referred to as the entropy. Now, entropy will start off as less or as more organized. And as entropy increases, it becomes less organized. It becomes more random. And so if you look at this molecule, let me do this demo again. We're going from more organized into more random. So if you're asked what is happening to the entropy in this little example, I'll watch it again, the entropy is going to be increasing. So the disorder or the randomness in this system is going to be increasing. And so again, looking at that, that's going to be increasing. Same thing holds true for if we add heat to this cherry bomb, it's going to increase the entropy in that system. And it's going to create more randomness, which is going to create more disorder in the universe itself. And so to kind of sum up Gibbs free energy and looking at our change in available energy, if that change is negative, it proceeds spontaneously to the right, and that would be considered an exergonic reaction. So again, if delta G is negative, meaning it is less than 0, then it's going to be a spontaneous reaction that's releasing energy into the system. And an example of that would be cellular respiration. If delta G is 0, we would say that system is in equilibrium. And if delta G is greater than 0, then that reaction will not proceed spontaneously. And we refer to that as an endergonic reaction. And it would be classified as endothermic. And an example of that would be photosynthesis. So last but certainly not least, we're going to talk briefly about adenosine triphosphate, which is our universal energy currency. So this is short-term free energy storage molecule, and it's used in all biological systems. It's a modified nucleotide. So we're taking the adenine ribose phosphate, or that sugar phosphate nitrogenous base, which is AMP. We add one phosphate, and we get ADP, or adenosine diphosphate, di, meaning that it now has 2 phosphates. If we phosphorylate that again, meaning we add another phosphate, then we get good old ATP, our energy molecule, adenosine triphosphate, meaning it has 3 phosphates. And then energy is harvested from this molecule whenever we break that high energy phosphate bond. And each time we break that bond, it releases energy. Now, breaking off that 3rd phosphate releases the most energy. So I hope that was helpful. For more videos like this, Go to www.nerdlingscience.com. This is the Queen Nerdling signing off. I hope you have a great day.